This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Petra Wend, Professor Emerita and former Principal and Vice-Chancellor at Queen Margaret University, Chair of the University Council of the University of Hamburg, and now Studiosity Academic Advisory Board member. Welcome.
So today I'm speaking to Vivienne Stern, Chief Executive Officer of Universities UK. Thanks for being here, Vivienne.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. So what we normally do in this podcast, we ask people to bring an object that they think is interesting, that might be interesting to other people, that has some kind of significance for you. Did you bring one?
I did. I didn't have to go very far to bring this because this is a picture that hangs next to my desk, and you probably can't see it very well, but it's a print of an engraving by William Blake. And, you know, I don't know whether I should just describe it. It's a small, very, very small print. The original engraving is very small, and it has a tiny, very simple figure standing at the bottom of a ladder. And the ladder, which is long and thin, reaches up and rests on a little crescent moon. And the picture is called I Want, I Want. And I've had this picture in various forms, a print of this engraving hanging over every desk I have worked at since I was at university. And there are two reasons I sort of wanted to bring it for this purpose. The first is because what it reminds me, and the reason I have it in my line of sight, it reminds me about the incredible importance of purpose, clear purpose, having a really, really clear sense of what you're trying to do here. It's so easy to lose it. It's so easy to lose it when you're writing an essay, which is, you know, why I had it at university. It's so easy to lose it in your work life. And for me, you know, that sense of trying to be really super clear. What are we trying to achieve here? What do we want to change? What is it that we want to be different because we turned up at work and did a bunch of stuff? You know, and I think it applies to your personal life sometimes too. The other reason is that I bought that postcard, and I bought two at the time. There was another little Blake engraving with a drowning man with his hands sort of just poking up above the waves, and the title of that little engraving is "Help!" I bought them because I was trying to persuade an extremely illustrious professor of English literature to supervise me in my final year. Her name was Anne Barton. She is a professor of English literature, and she specialises in the study of Shakespeare. And she happens to be married to John Barton, who is an extremely revered director. And I did a paper in my third year at Cambridge on Shakespeare and performance, and she was the person I wanted as a supervisor, but she doesn't supervise undergraduates because, like many people who are illustrious academics, you know, they don't need to, frankly. They've got better things to do with their time. So I thought really hard, how do I get Anne Barton to think I'd like to meet this person and have a conversation about whether they might supervise me? And I thought, that's the way. You know, try and get her interested in by giving her something which sort of boils down. You're going to want to meet this person because this person wants you and they want your help, and that might be interesting. And it worked. It really worked. So that was great.
So the I Want is a really motivating poster for you. So it really speaks to you.
Yeah, it
to
does.
Your ambition and not giving up.
Yeah, and not giving up is an extremely important part of it, but mostly it's about just knowing what you're trying to achieve, just being really and trying to make yourself come back to that again and again and again.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Before we talk about university, I've already alluded to your third year and Cambridge and so on. It would be nice to talk about your school.
Yeah.
Because education starts obviously way before university.
Yeah.
What was school like for you?
Do you know, a very funny thing happened yesterday. I was speaking at a conference, and at the end of it, somebody came up to me and said, "Did you go to St John's Primary School in Leicester?" And it was somebody who I'd been at primary school with, who I hadn't seen since I was 9. So that was really kind of funny. I think I was very happy at school. I think I'm a curious creature in the sense that I think I've always been reasonably happy in institutions. I mean, I should say that my first primary school, I think I was probably deeply unpopular and a bit bullied, you know. So I moved primary schools when I was I must have been about 7. And I was still a bit picked on at primary school. I mean, partly because I've always been I've always been a sort of slightly wonkish, you know, even at the age of 9, I think I was, or 8 or 9, I was probably kind of pretentious and a bit, you know, I used a lot of polysyllables, and I think I probably got, you know, I didn't really fit in very comfortably at primary school, but then at secondary school, I sort of found my place, and I was just very happy. And I went back to my secondary school recently to give a prize giving talk, which was just such a joy. And one of my teachers is still always, in fact, retiring that year. And I think I was just very, very lucky. I was surrounded by people who wanted to, you know, that when, you know, being sort of being interested and wanting to work hard and wanting to do well, and being interested in sort of ideas and being ambitious, academically ambitious, wasn't a bad thing. I think there were probably lots of schools, and it probably was a little bit the case in my primary school, where, you know, it makes you super unpopular. It's just not cool. And so to be in a school where I didn't feel that, I think I was very lucky.
Was that a special school, a private school, or was it a state school?
So I went to a what was at that stage a grant maintained grammar school in for my secondary school. So yes, it was a fee paying school, but at that stage subsidized by the government.
Mm. Would you say that your teachers played an important part in your education?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think probably like a lot of people, there are a couple of teachers who I think had who had a formative influence on me. Again, I got a note a few weeks ago from a guy called Stephen Pollard, who was my English teacher at secondary school and was one of 2 English teachers I had for A level. And there's absolutely no doubt I did English literature at university because I just loved studying in his classes. Him and there was another guy called Robert Kidd, and together they brought different things to the subject, but it was just so interesting and so rewarding. And for me, it was a bit of a kind of toss up between that and studying history, because I also had a great history teacher. But I was really lucky with some of my teachers. I mean, there were the odd person who I feel very guilty now, I probably didn't appreciate at the time. There's one teacher in particular who tried to teach me geography, and I wasn't very good at drawing maps, which at the age of, you know, I guess probably I must have been around about 11. He sort of made a comment in a parents' evening about thinking that I had a mental block when it came to drawing maps. And I just took this as the most colossal insult and immediately gave up geography for GCSE, which I think was probably a mistake. But, you know, I think that there's the odd thing where you sort of, you know, what a teacher says to you really sticks.
It really does, because I had exactly the same example in geography. My maps weren't appreciated by the teacher, but the problem was that I'm actually good at art, and I was good at art, so I could draw. But I insisted on making the maps more beautiful,
which is lovely, right?
and geography was my least popular subject in the end. So we can't give subjects in Germany, so we just have to continue studying them. But I was so offended and sad about it as well. And it was the maps.
Yeah, it's a funny thing as well that it kind of reminds you how people in positions of some authority over you, as teachers are with pupils at school, you can say something which you think is either kind of borderline quite funny or is not intended in any way as a major criticism. But it sticks and it hurts, and I think probably you know, there've been occasions in my career where I've made an offhand comment to somebody which they have taken really as an insult, and I think probably have to be quite careful of that.
Yes, But especially in schools, isn't it? In the forming years, it's quite incredible the influence the teachers have on you. And isn't it great that you're still in contact with some of your teachers now?
Well, I mean, like I say, I'm Stephen Pollard, my English teacher, I'd lost contact with for 20 years. I mean, the last time I saw him, I was at university, and he sort of popped a note in my pigeonhole, and I sort of met him for a coffee. But yeah, I hope I'll be able to see him again. He was a wonderful teacher.
And school must have helped you to get into university.
Yes, I mean, no question about it. I mean, I think I wasn't necessarily, and I don't think anybody thought I was a slam dunk, that I would get necessarily a place at Cambridge. But I certainly, I was encouraged and supported, and I think that made a big difference.
So you managed to get into Cambridge. And what was your university experience like?
Well, I still feel that it was it's just an incredible privilege to be part of a community like that, and I still get a little bit of a sort of a kind of thrill from visiting the university and thinking about what's going on in all of those buildings. I mean, I think it's quite an extraordinary place to be able to spend a bit of time, even as an undergraduate. And I think it's quite important to make sort of clear. I did a kind of bachelor's degree. I have not yet done a master's. I think in this field, a lot of people sort of assume I've got at the very least a master's, but probably a PhD. And I don't. And so I don't want to sort of overclaim for my kind of academic credentials. I could have taken, that Cambridge automatically converts bachelor's degrees into master's degrees if you stay out of prison and give some cash. I may have got that wrong. They may have changed the rules, but anyway, I didn't convert it because I thought that was sort of borderline unethical. I might try and do a master's. I'm right across the road from Birkbeck. And Birkbeck's got some fantastic master's programs that I would love to be able to do, but I just don't think I've got the bandwidth right now. But eventually I'll do a master's.
Yeah, but the job you're doing, I think you will have very, very spare time.
Yeah.
But as an undergraduate student, what was the worst? What was the best?
So I spent a lot of my time doing sort of plays, basically. So I did a lot of kind of directing, a lot of acting, a lot of producing plays. I thought that was actually, at the time, I probably thought I was sort of getting away with it and combining my degree with doing that. Now I think that a huge amount of that experience is, has been quite valuable to me. And things like working in teams, managing budgets, managing a big project, even things that are kind of quite logistical. One of the most challenging things I did in the whole 3 years I was at university was cater for a group of 24 students taking a production of Hamlet around Europe. And I had to feed them 3 meals a day for, I think we were on the road for about 20 days with a baby belling. And a budget of, it was a kind of crazy budget of something like a couple of £100. And I've never done, I don't think there's anything I've ever done that has been quite as stressful as that. And this sort of idea, you get these great big hulking blokes who need to be fed. Trying to do it on a baby belling with 300 quid or whatever it was. So, but I mean, the degree, I had such freedom. I mean, I chose to study in a college which was very small because I thought that would allow me to choose supervisors from different colleges. Because if you're taught in a college which has big English department, then you're going to be taught in college. And I kind of knew that there would be people all over the university who had interesting things going on. So I really did get to select, supervisors and ask them if they would supervise me. I think that's enormous privilege. But there are lots of things about that degree which I think are pretty, with hindsight, I think are not so great. I mean, when I kind of go around universities now, I think about how limited, it was in terms of its breadth. It was kind of English literature 1300 to the present day, and that meant 1950, because if you're not good and dead, then how can you possibly know whether it's literature? So yeah.
You said at the beginning that you enjoyed all the freedom at university to choose, so you must have had the confidence to do that, and in a way already the experience as well. Did you learn that at school, or did you have that anyway? Because I can imagine that some young people might be quite intimidated by that.
Oh, goodness, I don't know how to answer that. I think that I've got probably everybody has a mixture of sort of there'll be things about which you're super confident and things about which you have no confidence at all. I'm sure that's true of me too. But the kind of when I look back on it, I think it's quite surprising that I went in with this mindset that I could probably approach somebody who was an illustrious academic and ask them to supervise me. I mean, I don't know where that came from. One of the good things about what happened to me was that because I was doing lots of sort of drama, I was with people who were third years in my first year, and actually most of my friends, my really good friends, even to this day, were a year above me. So they'd sort of worked out how the system works. And whilst, as I say, I think there were kind of some limitations to the way that the English degree is taught in Cambridge, or was at that time. For me, working in teams with people who were more experienced, including actually master's students and PhD students, that probably gave me this kind of, oh, you can do that. And it meant that, say, the person I asked to supervise me I did a paper from the Italian tripos, but actually I think I was probably a bit arrogant with hindsight. I did a paper from the Italian tripos in studying Dante. And I did that because somebody 2 years above me just thought that this guy, Robin Kirkpatrick, was the most amazing person he'd ever met. So, it was that sort of knowledge transfer, I suppose.
Great. Cambridge and Oxford are quite different to
Yeah.
other universities. I assume you felt very well supported, or do you think there could have been more support?
I had a fantastic time, right? But it's a sink or swim, in a sense, it's a sink or swim environment. And I don't think that there are many universities that provide much more individualized support to students, and for whom, there is a kind of obvious stake in student success, which I don't think it was at all my experience. It was like, you're lucky to be here. Here is the world at your feet. You make what you can of it. And if you decide you don't care and you dial it in, that is your choice. You go right ahead. When I think about how hard many other universities work to take students who've got much less sort of supported educational backgrounds, who need much more side by side and dedicated and personalized support to make sure that they can take advantage of that opportunity, I think there's no question, which in my view makes a better university. I was lucky to be in an academic community from which I managed to really profit. But did Cambridge, make much of an effort to form me? Not really. The one like the university you led, the sort of care you will have taken over your students would dwarf anything that Cambridge. Now, that was I'm now old enough that I can say that was like last century, and I'm sure things have changed even at Cambridge, and it's probably different in other degrees, but. That's why I get really irritated by people talking about good universities and bad universities. Cambridge would be an utter disaster for probably the majority of students, for whom that would you would be a bit lost. You need something that will help work with you to form your. I just think it's the right environment for a very small number of students. I was at Leeds Trinity recently, and I was taken around by a student who was neurodiverse, who had been estranged from her parents, and for whom, being in a community where people know your name, where you have kind of a degree of kind of personal relationship with the kind of well-being staff. That's the right university for somebody who, that student was effusive about the support they got. And there's no such thing, therefore, in my view, as a good university. There's the right kind of university for the right student, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. It's very refreshing to hear that you say that. Obviously, you have the experience and the knowledge now of all the universities, which is great. But there are obviously still many people who've only gone to Oxford or Cambridge.
Yeah.
Who went on to do something completely different away from universities, and who would still say and claim, obviously, my university is the best in the UK or even the best in the world.
Yeah.
We hear that a lot.
Yeah. And it's based on a huge amount of sort of prejudice and ignorance. And I think, I do think it's really an important part of my job to try and explain to people, and I'm sure we don't do it well enough, that the rankings are based on a set of metrics which you can compare internationally. And that means they're predominantly based on research. We do not have an internationally comparable data set on teaching. It just doesn't exist. And therefore, you can't compare the quality of teaching in the same way. And then there are proxy measures for the quality of teaching, which include things like staff-student ratios or the proportion of international students compared to domestic staff or international faculty. If you're a research-intensive, highly ranked university, those proxy measures for teaching will they'll almost inevitably be better because you've got more resources, lower staff-student ratio, you've got the ability to attract international staff and students, you do well. These things are mutually reinforcing. They don't actually tell you whether a university is good. One of the things that I like about the UK, although all rankings are equally, in a sense, equally problematic, is we've got lots and lots of different ways of looking at objective information about quality of universities. So I can't remember who won the What Uni Student Choice Awards this year, but my guess is it would be one of the kind of very, very small community-based institutions that just whacks it out of the park when it comes to student experience. I was talking to the Vice-Chancellor of Birmingham Newman University, and they typically do very, very well. In fact, they may have won again this year. So these kind of and the kind of other domestic league tables, which have more data to draw on from a kind of teaching point of view, can give you a different sense of. But then as an applicant, you have to kind of decide what's important to you, and which comes back to kind of who are you and what do you want to get out of being at university?
The problems with ranking is it's based on quantitative measures, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what uni, for example, asks students themselves of their opinion. So this is why you have normally new universities leading. I know that Middlesex University and What Uni got a top in a number of categories as well. Yeah.
And it's because they work hard, right? And I think there is I don't want to be disparaging about any institution in our membership, but when I obviously visit universities of all types, and there are universities where that the Vice-Chancellor is thinking constantly about the student experience. They're thinking about, where is it not as it should be and how can I make it better? And then there are universities where I just don't think that's it's not as so much a top of mind issue. There's a bit more kind of complacency over the role that the university plays. And I'm not going to name names, but I think it's why I'm sometimes I'm not naming names, but every now and again you'll kind of hear from somebody who their offspring has gone to university and they find it disappointing that they're getting very little kind of personalized support, and you kind of think, well, would you have considered applying to one of the big post-92 institutions that really will think about who you are and what you need to succeed? You wouldn't, because you're too snobbish. But if that was what was important to you, then you should have been thinking about that when you. But anyway, I try not to rant at people over dinner.
Okay, but before we get more to universities and the challenges nowadays, how did you get to Universities UK? So what happened since your degree?
Well, it was all a terrible mistake. So first of all, when I was just coming towards the end of my degree, I sort of started, it started occurring to me that at some point I was going to have to earn a living. And it turned out I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. I'd never set foot in the careers service. When I did, they thought I should probably be a police officer, which I thought was unlikely, given that I'm 5'1.5" and extremely short-sighted. So I went to Italy because I thought, well, I might as well be learning a second language whilst not knowing what to do. And so I went and I studied Italian for 3 months in Bologna, and I taught English. Turned out teaching is not also my métier, and also that I don't understand the English language, despite having studied English literature, or sort of, what is a phrasal verb? Never heard of this thing. Turns out English is kind of interesting. And then I ended up doing English I think the school I was working for realized that what I'd be really useful for, Bologna is a big university city, is helping professors polish up their material for publication. So I did a little bit of that. And then I went to work in San Remo, which is a kind of ridiculously, it's this It's this town on the Ligurian coast that's really famous for a kind of massively tacky music festival every year, but it's quite
Not
beautiful.
tacky at all. I follow it every night.
Well, so that was a lovely place, and I lived there for 3 or 4 months, working for a company that ran summer schools. And then I came back to the UK and I moved in with a couple of friends, and I'd spent all my money on the deposit for the flat. So I just had to get a job. Like I literally had to get a job that week. And so I went into temp agencies on Victoria, in Victoria around Whitehall, because I was, the kind of thought have occurred to me that, all these government departments and things must be hiring from somewhere. So I temped for a bit. I did a stint at the Royal Geological Society, and at the Medicine Control Agency as a kind of receptionist. And I wasn't perhaps very good at it, but I quite enjoyed all of that. I've enjoyed every job I've ever had. And then I got a job working for an MP, which I did for about 18 months, a guy called Barry Shearman, who was the chair of the Education and Skills Committee, which was a great experience. I learned a lot. I didn't enjoy it a huge amount. And I got to the point where I just needed to get out after about 18 months. And I applied for about 50 jobs. And, like many recent graduates, a lot of them I didn't get even a reply, let alone interviewed. And then after must have been about 2 months, I got 2 interviews on the same day, one working as an administrator in a advertising body, and the other working as a parliamentary officer in Universities UK. And I got offered both jobs, and I took a weekend to think about it. The then director of communications, who's still a good friend of mine, from University UK, called me up and tried to persuade me that I didn't want a career in advertising, which, probably with hindsight is correct. So that's it. And then I started in University UK, walked in and I thought, I'll do 6 months. It looks really boring. But I've fallen in love with the place. I think I'm so lucky. It's been a huge privilege. I've done, 8 or 9 jobs. So I started in one of the kind of entry level roles, and I've wiggled my way through the organization. I came at one point within 2 days of a contract ending because I'd skipped from a permanent to a temporary contract to move into policy. And then I sort of came back into the kind of lobbying sphere as head of political affairs, and then led the international function for a few years. And then I've been chief executive for coming up for 3 years. So it's a very unusual career. I've got a very short biography. Started at Universities UK as small child.
Well, Universities UK is a huge organization, and there are so many roles. And I remember you as head of international as well.
Yeah.
And standing up in front of people and telling us about all the international developments. So what was that like as being head of international? Was there lots of traveling involved as well, or was it more policy?
Yeah, so it was a bit of a mixture of both. And at that stage, we had the jobs changed a lot. Poor old Jamie Arrowsmith, who now runs the international unit, it's 90%. There's a huge amount of domestic policy now in that role. But at the time, we were kind of trying to see whether, through working as a team with kind of embassies and the British Council and what was then the Science and Innovation Network overseas, we could make the kind of environment more favourable for UK universities to operate. And so we developed quite close relationships with ministries and officials in a set of significant countries, and that meant we did travel a lot, and we did sort of develop relationships and try to curate them, and that's still happening. I mean, DBT is now doing much more active, has taken on a lot of the work that I think we started doing. And I think we showed what could be done if you engage, if you sort of really deeply listen. We were also, at that stage, when I started, David Willetts was the universities minister, and he was absolutely brilliant at the international engagement, really good at sort of saying, look, here's what we could both get out of doing more together. So it was a great time, and it was a really kind of golden age of international collaboration in some ways, when I started in that job in 2014.
I think when David Willetts was there, lots of things were happening, weren't there?
Yeah.
So not only in the international arena, he was so engaged, wasn't he, with the university sector?
Yeah, and he still is. I mean, he's still very interested and actually very supportive. So yeah, he was a fantastic minister, and we've had a few ministers who really used their role in the because ministers have got the opportunity to develop relationships with their peers, and there are some university ministers who've really done that very well. It's difficult when you've got a kind of government that is under pressure because it doesn't have a large majority. So the back end of the Conservative government was a bit like that. Ministers couldn't travel. But, we did some good things in working with governments to enable them to develop kind of environments where, for example, transnational education could flourish. And we did a huge amount on international research collaboration, which I really enjoyed.
Great. And now you're chief executive, or you have been for 3 years. So you provide the stability to UK, aren't you? Because you are employed, you're in a permanent position, while you see constantly changing vice chancellors around you and also changing presidents of UK. Does that change the atmosphere and the politics of the university world, or has that all more or less stayed the same?
I think it does. I mean, presidents bring their own approach, and I think I can think of times when, the sort of the approach of the president has been, really very important in the way that Universities UK is perceived by its own members. I mean, both for good and bad, right? I mean, I think Sally Mapstone is an absolutely exemplary president. I think she's been fantastic, and I think she has, and I've seen her behind the scenes as well as in public. She deeply believes in the diversity of the university sector, and that is a strength. And I think that it's extremely important for a membership body that has such a wide membership that you can advocate, genuinely and passionately for universities of different types. So, I will, if it comes to it, I will, lie down in front of the tanks for the UK's sort of position in global research terms, and the sort of preservation of our reputation for excellence. But I will not do that at the expense of institutions that serve an extremely important mission in different ways. And that includes our specialist institutions, our postgraduate only institutions. I've mentioned those institutions that sort of have their roots in sort of faith communities, so the Catholic and Anglican communities, which have produced a special group of institutions. The big civics, the places like Edgehill, where frankly you've got these things are. They're sort of distinctive and they fill a particular need, and we should be able to kind of passionately advocate for them too. And I think Sally has really she believes it, and she demonstrates it when she talks. I think there have been occasions when there are, it's not that hard for a perception to build up that UK cares more about one group of universities than another. And the approach of the president is quite important in that. And there have been occasions that I can think of where that's been the case. But we've had some fantastic presidents. I mean, Ivor Crewe, I don't know whether you remember Ivor
yes,
Crewe.
I remember Ivor.
I loved working with Ivor Crewe, particularly on the kind of political engagement. I think he was just very, very funny to watch. And I learned a lot from watching him.
Yeah. Now, Sally is a special person, and I interviewed her as well as part of this podcast series. Yes, no, she's fantastic.
Well, I'll listen to that one.
Yes, no, you do.
Yeah.
So now tell us about the challenges in the university sector. I mean, only a few years ago, it seemed Brexit was a big challenge, and that is, I mean, obviously it's still there, and we still suffer from it. But so many other things have happened since, particularly the financial crisis. Is it really that bad in the sector?
I think it's difficult. In a way, I try to avoid using the word crisis, because I think that there is a fundamental structural problem in the funding of teaching and research. There's no question. I think that affects all universities. It affects, every part of the system for different reasons. All 4 nations of the UK, there is a structural problem with the funding of teaching and research. And, that we have to find a way to address that, because the consequences of not addressing it will be that we erode this extremely important national capability. That probably feels like a crisis in some institutions. And again, I'm not going to name names, but there are certainly institutions where I think it's not impossible that a point will be crossed, a moment will come when it's difficult to see how that institution continues in the way that, that it has. And there are other institutions where there really genuinely isn't a problem, right? For one reason or another, the institution has managed to kind of adapt its cost base in a way that means they've got healthy reserves. They are, not in deficit. They're able to invest and grow. And that's not all because of competitive position. I've seen institutions that are kind of in good health in all parts of the sector, but they are in a minority. And the majority of institutions are somewhere between those poles. So, finding the almost continuous deterioration in the kind of operating conditions and extraordinary strain, doing what needs to be done to balance budgets, often at the expense of things that under other circumstances you would want to be able to preserve. Huge number of job losses in the sector. Courses being closed, people scaling back on the research that they do. And, within that, there's probably a spectrum of institutions who have managed to do that in a way that feels strategic and likely to leave them in a stronger position, and institutions where it's just sort of tactical. It's just, we've got to balance the book. So we're just going to do it fast. And then, there'll be other problems that arise from that. So I think it's a system-wide problem. I think it is a crisis in a small number of institutions.
And do you think there's still a separation between old and new universities, or is the picture pretty mixed now?
It's really mixed. It's really mixed because it's gravity. You get, universities of all types that are responding to the same fundamental conditions. I mean, the only thing I would say is that the research, the kind of the loss on research activity, the volume of that is about 6 billion compared to the kind of loss on teaching side, which in I think the last time we looked at it was about 1.5 billion. So if you're kind of losing money on both, then you're going to have, big trouble. I think the other thing is international students and the patterns. I mean, people have different dependencies on, parts of the world that are differentially affected by visa policy. So if you have robust recruitment from parts of the world where, changes to dependent rules or post-study rules don't really impact demand, then you're going to be in a slightly more robust position. And of course, there's been some really, very hyper competitive behavior on domestic admissions, which I think has weakened universities that are absolutely outstanding. And they're just in a sense being weakened by the behavior of competitor institutions. And I know that's a source of extraordinary concern in some parts of the sector.
Do you think that means that some universities will give up some activities, not only courses? I think that is quite evident, but also say, we need to forget about research. We can't afford that anymore. We really can just do teaching or concentrate on teaching. Is this something that is happening in the sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see that. We just recently did a survey which asked institutions to tell us sort of what changes they were making or planning to make. And about 20% of the institutions which responded to that survey said they were reducing research activity. And we can certainly see lots of examples of people trying to focus on strengths. So it may be that even in an institution that isn't broadly research intensive, there are 1 or 2 areas that are very important. They might be very well aligned to a particular kind of industrial cluster in a particular place, and you want to preserve it and be able to continue to sort of be strong in a small number of areas. But trying to kind of spread your resources a little bit less thinly, trying to kind of manage the amount of time that's allocated to research, make sure that that's sort of mindfully done. I think that is what's happening. And maybe there will be whole universities that say, do you know what, our mission is teaching and we're not going to try to sustain. I mean, the issue is, I think that most people in this sector believe that there is a very, very strong connection between not only being at the, abreast of developments in research, but being actively engaged in research, because it is an environment in which you're training people who need to themselves develop research skills. And I think, therefore, it would be a mistake to let ourselves get into a situation where there are universities that simply have no research activity, that have no research culture.
Yeah, I understand. The UK have written a number of papers, really evidence-based papers, be it on migration, to influence visa policy, on funding, and so on. Do you think they've made a difference with government, particularly now looking at, again, how the budget is going?
Yeah, I know we have. I mean, I know we have. I know that the graduate route was introduced because we pushed for it. And it was protected on 3-4 occasions because we lobbied like hell to keep it. I know that it doesn't feel like this to, many institutions, but we've got a government that actually does recognise a financial sustainability challenge in the sector. And I believe we're going to see a little bit of action. I don't think it'll necessarily come today with the spending review, but I think, and it will, I think there will be different points in the 4 nations of the UK. But I think in the Westminster government, there will be action to demonstrate that they understand that the government too has to support this, the financial sustainability of the sector. And I think, the relationship with government is, broadly speaking, quite a good one. I think, it's different in different parts of it. And both Scotland and Wales have got elections coming up next year. And the dynamics are kind of difficult in Scotland, I think, in particular. But yeah, I think the UK is having influence at this sort of headline level and on the small stuff.
I'm really glad you're mentioning the 4 nations, because having been a Scottish Vice-Chancellor, I always know that I felt a little bit left out, or we Scottish people felt a little bit left out in the UK, because clearly there were only 19 of us, and policy seemed to be dominated by England and by the English universities. Now, in England, we have the Office for Students that regulate the system, the sector. In Scotland, it's still the Scottish Funding Council. How do you see the difference, how they pan out in the devolved nations? Because when I moved back to England, for example, I had to acquaint myself with the Office for Students, and I'm learning more and more about it. And what I hear from English universities, they feel quite beleaguered by the Office for Students, by their lack of response, by trying and trying and trying and trying, and not getting a lot back, and it feels like a constant struggle, which feels different to the Scottish Funding Council in Scotland, where, as you know, recently the University of Dundee was bailed out on a short term, for example. What is your impression?
So I think there are swings and roundabouts. I mean, first of all, to your point about Scottish, Welsh, and perhaps most particularly Northern Irish universities feeling sometimes a little bit left out of the UK conversation. This really bothers me. I mean, when I started in this job, I stuck a little Post-it note on the cupboard in front of my desk, which just said UK, because it's so easy for us to forget when you're dealing with a sector which has got the numbers just lead you to spend a lot of time thinking about England, because it's just such a very, very large proportion of the total membership. I think it's the one of the things I've really tried to do is make sure I work really closely with the University's Scotland team and the University's Wales team. I'm in Scotland and Wales frequently, and that we try to make sure that we everything we do or say, we just acknowledge when we're talking about a UK-wide issue or a kind of England-only issue. And that kind of, in a sense, should try to keep us a bit more honest about where we're putting our time. On the policy landscape, it swings and roundabouts. So you mentioned some of the frustrations in the English sector with the OFS. There are some absolutely clear benefits of the different relationship in Scotland and the SFC. I think it's much more like a partner with the sector in many ways. But at the same time, you've got a system which has constraints which can, in a sense, come with that different relationship, and the political context, which has, I think, left Scottish universities in a, broadly speaking, worse position than English institutions for all the kind of annoyance of dealing with the kind of accountability. And Wales is maybe somewhere in the middle. We've got an interesting development with the creation of MEDA. MEDA has, under Simon Perot's leadership, I think, been, broadly speaking, a very kind of good partner with the Welsh sector. It's just acquired a new chief executive. I have not yet met him, but I think it's a very important appointment. And as I say, the 2026 elections for both Scotland and Wales are going to be very important in determining what the relationship between the government and the sector and the regulator and the sector is. But it's sort of, I think you will probably recall every now and again you'll have conversations in the UK where all the English members decide they'd like to move to Scotland or vice versa. And we've all got our own unique troubles, and some of the kind of features are, you'd want and you don't have.
You feel quite optimistic about the UK university sector.
Yes, I feel entirely optimistic about the university sector. I think we're going through a bad patch. I really do. And I mean, I kind of feel a bit annoyed that I think the period that I'm chief executive might coincide with a period in which the policy sort of landscape feels pretty difficult and the funding landscape is pretty constrained. But I absolutely feel optimistic. I mean, I think this is a sector which has gone from strength to strength, and our job is to make sure that it does that in this next era. And I think it will change for sure. One of the sort of, I suppose, challenges that I think we've got to deal with, and one of the great difficulties of a job like this, I mean, you must recognize this from, roles where you are just constantly battling with today's problem, is being able to think about the medium to longer term. But I think in the last 2 decades, this sector has gone through the process of massification, and it's been positive. That has been a good thing. It means that there are lots of people who go to university now who wouldn't have done it in the past. And the university system has become much more flexible and responsive to serve students of different needs. That's a good thing. And it's probably not quite finished yet, because you're still twice as likely to go to university if you're from the most affluent groups in society compared to the least affluent. So we're probably not done with massification. But we are still evolving the kind of mechanisms to cope with what is a fundamentally different system. And I think if you take the dinosaurs' eye view of it, fine. That's actually, we're still at the beginning of a new era of mass higher education participation, which is, I think, going to be a permanent feature of our landscape. But for sure, this system's going to have to evolve. So it's not trying to deliver higher education in the same way that it did in the, previous century. And I think that's kind of for us getting into the kind of change is good, change is necessary. If we want to keep this, the massification of higher education, then change is part of the story. I think that's probably, that's the bit I'd like to spend more time thinking about.
And I was also struck by what you talked about. You talked about long-term goal and midterm goals. And I think that's very important. If you feel very stressed and because of all the problems you're in and you're battling every day with these issues, it's so important not to forget the long-term goal, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the only way you can get out of it.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, I'll tell you what, for me, is at the top of that ladder. It's 2 things: financial sustainability across all 4 nations, and it's the reputation of the sector. And I figure maybe I'll do this job for, I don't know, I've been doing it for 3 years. Maybe it would be healthy for me to do it for another 5 or so. And then probably at some point, somebody will want to boot me out of UK. But I'd like to be able to say at the end of that, that period, I did achieve something on the financial sustainability of the university sector in all 4 nations of the UK. And we have done something to begin to address. It probably won't be a completed task, but to begin to address the reputation of the sector. That's what I kind of keep in mind every single day.
Great. That brings me back to sort of going more the personal level. What have you learned in your role as chief executive of UUK? What have you personally learned?
I think this is going to sound like a slightly banal answer to the question, but I think the most important and shocking lesson I keep learning is how important your decisions about how to use time are. I'm hopeless at it. I'm hopeless at it, and it stops me doing the job I want to do. And I can't, I can't tell you I know what the solution is, but I spend so much of my time is committed, that it stops me from doing things that I think are my responsibility to do. So that's a really important lesson I keep learning. I feel hugely privileged in the sense that I'm learning every single day about the sector. I get to visit institutions. Every week I'll be in a university and I get to see something, often, things that I've never seen before. And I am constantly learning about the kind of, I regard myself fundamentally as a lobbyist. I mean, I think fundamentally that's what I am. And I'm still learning about how to influence political decisions. And it's so hard sometimes, but that I find that endlessly fascinating.
Great. And then shifting the perspective a bit to students. What do you think could be done better for students? What could you change to make the student experience better? What could it be?
Well, there's a very obvious thing in the English context around maintenance support, where maintenance support has been eroded, for such a long period that I think it's quite hard to see how many students are really being given a fair opportunity to succeed in their studies without having to do so much part-time work that they're just held back from doing the kind of things we talked about. I got the chance to do, to do things which give you all sorts of opportunities to develop skills at a point in your career. If I had had to keep down 2 jobs, working in a cafe or a bar or in a shop, I wouldn't have got to write and direct and act in plays or tour Europe. I mean, what a huge difference in the experience that would have been. And I think we've got maintenance as a real issue. Having said that, the most generous maintenance regime in the UK is in Wales, and participation is falling. And that takes me to the second thing. I think this sector's got a great story to tell on adapting the way it delivers higher education to meet the needs of different sorts of students and to address the differences in educational outcomes from students from different backgrounds. But we have certainly got work to do to make university more accessible to people at different stages of their lives, to work out how to fix those cold spots where you get very low participation in higher education. Why is it 13% of 18-year-olds in Barrow and Furness go to university and 70% in Kensington and Chelsea? Yes, it will be about maintenance, but it's more than that. And I think that that's part of it. Then there's a kind of more difficult set of issues about what is the right level of support for a university to provide a student, kind of including both academic and pastoral support within the limits of affordability. And I think that is in a sense, a debate the sector is going to have with itself.
Do you think it's much wider than that? You just gave the examples of Kensington and 70% and 17% somewhere else.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Denmark, for example, where taxes are very high, but people are very happy to pay those high taxes because they see what they get.
Yeah.
And university students, they actually get paid for going to university.
Yeah.
And seem to be very happy. Participation is good, universities are good, but most importantly, the culture is that the Danish people seem to be happy to pay their tax because they benefit from it personally, not only the students, like free gyms for the elderlies and so on for health. So there is that something you think the UK would ever get to?
I don't know. I mean, this is a bigger question than university policy. This is about the kind of societal appetite for high tax, high sort of benefit. I think the worrying thing is that we're moving into an era in which you'll get higher taxes but you won't have the kind of, it's worth it, because the amount of money being swallowed up by a combination of the healthcare system and the welfare system. I think we're going to sort of find that the burden of taxation is increasing, and yet you're not sort of, in a sense, in a position where, and I don't know, when I started my career, university was almost entirely paid for by public grant, the cost of teaching were almost entirely paid for by the block grant. And there was this constant argument between higher education, schools, hospitals, today it would be defence. And the reason I think UK at the time supported a shift to the graduate contribution is because it would give you a stability that you will not get if you're up against those extremely hungry public services. And so, I mean, whilst I think I quite often, whenever I visit, I think Denmark's a wonderful country, and there are parts of Northern Europe and the kind of Baltic states where you think there's something here which it's a different way of living, but I don't think the UK is like, in some way, it's a societal. There's a huge societal difference, so. I don't think it would be easy to wish it away. I do, though, think the balance between the public contribution and the private contribution to higher education is wrong. It's wrong in Scotland, where it's too far towards the public contribution, and it's wrong in England, or it's too far towards the private contribution. There must be somewhere in the middle.
Great. Final question. Although I don't know whether you can answer it, because you explained so well with your want, your career. So you were always very clear with your ambitions. But my final question would be, do you have any advice that you would have given to your younger self that you know now, but you didn't know then?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I've never had any career plan. I didn't when I wandered into UK. I thought it was just a desperate move to get out of a job I didn't like. And I still don't have a career plan. And I think that there's part of me would want to say that actually following your nose isn't the worst thing. You learn what you enjoy doing, and then you can sort of see where that might take you in that kind of iterative career development approach. How would you know when you were 18 what you want to do when you're 50? It would be absurd, unless you really have a vocation. I think it would be absurd anyway for somebody from my kind of background to sort of have a clear sense of where things went. But I do think the one piece of advice that I do give to people is look at people you admire and try and work out what it is about them that you admire. For me, having a sense of purpose is important, and that's not about, for me, it's not about, money or position. It's about, do I think this job is worth spending a huge chunk of my time on? And does it make a contribution to, I'm going to say, public good? I don't want to sound too I don't want to be too arm wavy about it, but you're going to spend a huge amount of your time doing whatever it is you do to earn a living. Make it count. Life is very, very short. And I would like to be able to look back at the end of my career and think, yes, it was rewarding and satisfying, and I worked with great people, but I also did something I'm proud of. So that's sort of, I think, the best advice I could give. Find people you admire, work out why you admire them, and do something that matters to you.
Well, they are great final words, Vivienne. Thank you so much for speaking to me. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you. And it's nice to see you again.
You have been listening to Studiosity's podcast, Reimagining Higher Education, candid conversations within higher education, sharing stories of leadership, change, and best practice in teaching and learning. Visit studiosity.com.